Hi, my name is Juan, and welcome to The Couch, a podcast where real therapists talk about real things. Please remember that we are therapists, but we are not your therapists, and this podcast is intended for educational purposes only. Boundaries. Man, let's do an episode on boundaries and mental health. Boundaries come up. They come up in just about every situation. Boundaries are your ability to get home and put the phone down because it's family time. Boundaries is your ability to be at work and someone says, "Hey, could you help me with this? Could you take this on?" And inside your heart that not only does it feel good to help others and to say yes, that. There's a voice in your brain going, "Yo, you are already behind on your own work. So as much as you want to be able to show up and help this person, you're probably going to show up at a 50% and it's going to put you further behind on your own work. So during this moment, say that you can't. Say no." Boundaries, your ability to bring that voice out, to find that balance between knowing that there is good in helping others and showing up and taking on additional tasks, and knowing when you've overextended yourself, when you're able to say no, and no is not bad. Boundaries are everywhere in life. And boundaries can they can really build a relationship, they can break a relationship. And of course, that's boundaries if they're respected, and boundaries if they are just not respected. Myself as a counselor, boundaries come up with almost every client I work with. To some degree, we hover around it. I'd like for you to think about your life and simply just focus on, what are my boundaries? What are my boundaries? For a definition, a boundary is somewhat like a fence, a big old giant fence that you build, and it helps to protect your space, helps to protect you. And there's a big and it still fosters a space of connection. Boundaries aren't you controlling other people, right? That's often a mistake, a myth there. The boundary is you telling somebody else what they need to do with their life. That's not a boundary. Boundary is not you building a big fence and no one gets in, right? Because again, a boundary is a fence. It still allows connection. And we're going to get into that in a little bit. My goal as you dive in here with me is that we look at boundaries and mental health. We bring them both together, that connection there. I find that people are happier, much more stable, more excited to wake up, to live life, to do cool things when they know their boundaries and they know how the boundaries play a role in their life. And that's what I want for you. I want you to be excited, to be happy, to know that if you fall down, you can get back up. So here, once again, ask yourself, what are my boundaries? Maybe jot that down just in case you don't have them yet or don't fully know them. At times when a boundary is not fully present or consistent. So that would be like you got this fence around you, but it's leaning. You know the type. You've probably seen a fence like this. I don't know if your fence looks like this. It's leaning. You got some parts of that wood kind of chipped off, a few holes here and there. You look at it and you're like, damn, I need to paint that. I need to give it a second stain, if you will. You try to close your gate, but you can't because it needs some repair. So what happens is when a client shows up and I work with them, we may not go right away into what are your boundaries. Instead, what happens is that person comes up and says, "Hey, Dr. Santos, I feel drained, man. I feel burned out. I feel stuck. I feel like my partner doesn't respect me. I feel like I'm not getting anywhere in my job. I feel like I do too much for others. I feel overwhelmed. I feel like I never have time for myself." right? All sorts of things like that they share. And then from that, we find ourselves, all that funnels it into the boundary, right? Boundaries can be physical, emotional, time, energy, boundaries at work, boundaries in intimate relationships, boundary on a professional level. So maybe ask yourself that. Do I have physical boundaries? What are my emotional boundaries? What about my relational boundaries? What about my work, professional boundaries? And again, explore, see what comes up. Instead of solving something right away, we need to take a step back and really understand it. Understand what it's about. So as I mentioned before, a boundary, we can look at it as this fence around your home. And we want to think about what do we want to build that fence with? If each of those panels of wood represent something, what do they represent? Perhaps your values, perhaps what's important to you, perhaps what you allow in and you don't allow. Hopefully that gives you a little more clarity in understanding the boundary itself. Here's an idea of a exercise that we could do. We start with thinking about an area of life where you want a stronger boundary. Could it be with work, family, personal time? And let's say it's with work. Maybe you notice that you're working typical 40-hour week, and then you get home, and then again, you're on your phone, you're on your laptop, you're working, and then that's creating some disruption. Your partner saying, hey, put the phone down. Maybe you used to work out 4 days a week. Now you work out 4 days in the last 4 months. And then that's starting to sit in. You're starting to notice differences. Your knees hurt a little bit. You got more headaches. And you don't like those feelings. So then here, the work boundary would be that certain things have spilled over, right? At some point you had this fence, and the fence said, I'm going to have a balance of when I get home, I'm shifting into home mode, right? I'm focused on watering my plants that have to do with more of my personal life than my work life. And perhaps months ago you were able to do it. You were going to the gym 4 days a week. You were getting home and putting your phone down in that basket, right? Everyone in the house put their phone down in that basket, and you did too. And then something took place over time where you started to not put the phone in there. You started to skip 1 day at the gym, 2 days. So here's an example that I'm sharing with you of a boundary. It's a bit louder, hopefully easier to see. And then once you have it, the goal is that you acknowledge what it is. You try to see what kind of impact it's had on your life. You could go further. You could dig into it and go, what's the origin of this boundary? How was it born and brought into my life? And then you would include a piece of there and working to rebuild it, right? That panel, that fence that says boundary for work, right? You want to write it out on there and go, here's what it means, so I can rebuild it and abide by it. Now going back into what boundaries are. Boundaries, remember that fence. A fence in a way is a layer of protection, right? Because if you have a big fence, it's going to protect maybe all those wild ivies from coming into your yard. It could protect wild animals from coming into the yard. And then the other way around, protect maybe certain things on your side from going that way. So there is a layer of protection. Protection could be emotional, physical, mental. It's important to remember, as I mentioned again, that fence does not mean that there is no connection. So the boundary, it doesn't isolate you. And that's often a question people ask me. Well, if I build a fence, am I isolated now? How am I going to build a connection? Right? And no, because this really isn't a rigid fence. There's flexibility to it. right? You've got flexibility in the aspect of how each panel of the fence is defined. So let's play with an example here. Let's say that I've got a panel of my fence, and it's my boundary on relational, my relationship with people. And I know that I value respect. And respect means that I will put myself in spaces where people will treat me in a respectful way. And of course, I'll treat them in a respectful way. And if I find that I'm in a space and there is a pattern of being treated in a disrespectful way, and I've tried to address it, I have no control over the other person, though, remember? And then that person continues to maybe criticize and belittle me. I now have the opportunity to control myself and choose not to be in that space, right? So my fence, you could think about it as that boundary, which is I will be in spaces where I feel respected. So now if somebody comes into my fence, right, they cross it, they're crossing it with that acknowledgement. And if it happens that they come into the fence and there is that disrespect, then I'm having that conversation with them, right? Maybe I'm saying, Bob, I enjoy spending time with you, and we've known each other for years. To make this relationship work from my end, I need a healthy level of respect. Last week, we hung out, and in the week before that one, and there's been several times that you've criticized me in blah, blah, blah way, and really it hurt me. I bring this up. I bring this up because I want our relationship to continue. However, if this is the way that you will treat me, I can't continue this relationship. What would you like to do from your end? Right? So I shared with Bob where I'm at, what I'm feeling. And in essence, that's me sharing that boundary. That's me pulling those words from that fence that go over my boundary to this real life context. And then Bob's able to reply, okay, I agree, right? Maybe in different words, of course. Or no, they don't. And then if they don't, then I put that boundary much more firm. So much more firm could be that if I have another event, right, in my space of the fence, Bob is not included in that event, right? Or if there's another event somewhere else, and I know Bob is there, then I get the opportunity to think about, do I want to be in that space? And be mindful, I'm breaking this down in a top level. Of course, there's more intricate details, but that on a basic level would be that boundary. With the boundary, though, if somebody's going to do something like that, we want to make sure that there's a healthy reason for it. With boundaries, we look at building self-worth, building respect. So if I didn't follow that boundary and I continue to allow myself to be around Bob, the big question is, what's going to happen to my self-respect? What's going to happen to my self-worth, to my stress, to my burnout, to my resentment, to my exhaustion, to my feelings of being unappreciated? Are they going to get better? Or they're going to worsen over time? And then if they do worsen over time, what happens to me? How does that filter into my own life? And this is exactly why boundaries are, in my opinion, so important to you as an individual person. Because when you have this boundary, what you're basically saying is you're saying, hey, this is my way of protecting my mental health, my emotional health, my physical health. This isn't about me isolating. This isn't me telling you how you need to live your life. This is me. This is me knowing how I need to live my life. And it's flexible. It's healthy. Working with a counselor, what it does is it helps you look at your boundary, and it helps you evaluate if it's too rigid, which can be a thing, or if it's too weak. And weak meaning we got to just step it up and make sure his boundary is a bit louder, a bit stronger. Too rigid, in case you're wondering about that, too rigid would be where you place this expectation of everyone needs to look at me in the eyes and say, I don't know, say yes when I ask them to do something, right? Or they're not going to be allowed in my space, right? That would be many things that are not healthy, including too rigid, right? Because if you go back, you go, how does that really protect your mental health? How does that protect your emotional health, your physical health? Maybe there what you're doing is you're more creating a sense of control to appease some sort of feeling. Um, so just something to think about there. With boundaries, as mentioned before, I kind of went over them quickly, so to slowly touch on each. You got a physical boundary, that's the space, touch, privacy. You got time and energy boundary. So that's, you've been able to say, no, I can't take that on. Or if you got to take some rest, my friends, rest. Relational boundary, that goes into your romantic relationships, your friendships, your family, like what's happening in those spaces. Of course, work and professional boundaries. That's that balance in there of work and life, knowing your job role. So maybe an example of that could be late at night, 3 a.m., you're answering work emails. Why are you answering work emails at 3 a.m.? Come on now, right? That could be a boundary that needs to be addressed and needs to be a little bit strengthened. Emotional boundary. So being able to separate emotions from others, right? Regulating emotions. And then as I mentioned, this aspect of a rigid and a weak boundary. A weak boundary we could look at as one that we need to reinforce, right? If it's that fence, it's leaning way too far, right? That's not being flexible. So an example of a weak boundary could be people pleasing or overcommitting yourself. One that I see often is I feel guilty for saying no. Right, so those would be those weaker boundaries, and I'm not a big fan of the word weak in this aspect. I think they are really what's happening is much more of a, hey, this boundary and it needs help, it needs support to strengthen. And then you got rigid. Rigid could be you shut people out. One time you wrong me, we're done. Well, what happens with that is, and I'm not going into all these examples because I know there's different kinds. If you live by that motto, the aspect of being too rigid is it hinders you from growth. It hinders you from potential aspects of growth. Rigid boundaries could be that not only do you shut people out quickly, but you build these large emotional walls, and the walls restrict not only other people from connecting with you, but you from connecting with them. And sometimes what can take place is these rigid walls, they can actually build a sense of isolation. And remember when we started this, we looked at boundary as a fence. The fence is not supposed to limit connection. The fence is supposed to foster healthy connection. And often a rigid boundary will do quite the opposite. Isolates you. It builds these giant, thick fence walls that no one gets in. You don't get out. You're isolated. You're shutting people out. Sometimes when a person has these sometimes when a person has these boundaries that need work, so they're the weaker boundaries, they may have a lot of stress. And you can think about that. If you engage in people pleasing, if you're overcommitted, if you have a hard time saying no, you feel really guilty about it. Well, yeah, it's likely that because you're struggling with that boundary, you're going to feel this really high level of stress. You're going to be stressed the hell out. You're going to be anxious. You're going to be burned out, my friends. So then we look at, okay, let's get to this healthy boundary. Because once again, a healthy boundary, a healthy you. It's your emotional safety. It's your stronger self-confidence, self-esteem, self-worth. Right? It's a better, stronger, healthier, ongoing level of improvement for you. As you look at this, I want you to consider, and these are important because I think sometimes we may forget about them. The aspect of how to set a healthy boundary. No particular order. think it's helpful to know your limits, because that word limit, a limit can play with boundaries, and that play I find helpful. So there, what you could do is you could have a sheet of paper and you could look at what drains me, what energizes me, and then jot those things down. The ones that drain you, you're going to dig in and go, you know what? I am so drained by always saying yes and feeling guilty for saying no. Well, now you know you got to work on this boundary and improve it. The next aspect of how to set a healthy boundary, start small. You don't have to take on the whole world. Start small. Start saying no to one thing. Start working on one new boundary and then building that one over time. Get to know the definition of self-compassion. It helps with a boundary because you may find out that it's normal to feel a sense of guilt when you're looking at this aspect of saying no because you're overextended. And as you notice that guilt, also know that your needs matter. Right? So you want to give yourself self-love. Like, hey, my needs matter to take a break here. And yes, I feel guilty, but that doesn't mean that I have to lower my boundary and engage in people pleasing or say yes to this thing. And once again, with working with a counselor, you can go so much further into this, all the way from the aspect of role playing through like scripts that help navigate situations of boundaries that a lot of people find really helpful. Common challenges, and then we'll finish up here when it comes to boundaries. Fear. Sometimes people get really anxious and nervous and fearful, which makes sense. You know, those feelings are there with putting a boundary up. Like the classic one of, well, if I start saying no, they're going to not like me. They're going to be upset with me. So then sometimes the person will struggle to keep up their boundary. Another one is that guilt of feeling selfish. Like, man, if I put this boundary up, I feel selfish, like I'm only focusing on me. Well, hey, sometimes you do got to focus on you. Self-care starts with that self for a reason. And what I mean by that is there are times that you'll do things that are selfish for you. It doesn't mean that it is a negative selfish act, hurting someone else. So there, what I want you to think about is that aspect of even putting it on a paper, perhaps. What is selfish? What are things that I can do that are selfish? What are things that I can do that are for my self-care that feel selfish but aren't selfish? And then see what comes from that. At times I like to play with that even in my own mind, where it helps me differ between the two and then have a bit of external guidance that I see on that sheet of paper. Culture, family. We haven't talked about that in this topic of boundary, but I'll tell you, it is often deeply integrated. Because you got to think about boundaries from this lens. You got a boundary. And let's say you're listening to this and you're 42 years old. So you got a boundary. You're 42. And you got a bunch of boundaries, right? You got boundaries that are physical, emotional, work boundary, bunch of them. Here's the question. Where do they come from? Right? How did you learn them? How are they instilled in you? And likely they're rooted through upbringing and development, which means your microsystem, which means guardians and caretakers, which plays a role into the aspect of family and culture. And I know myself as a counselor, often when I'm speaking with someone on the topic of boundary, it's brought into some degree. They may share, well, it makes sense that I really struggle with this one. I grew up in a house that had a lot of yelling and, a lot of poking at each other, making fun of each other, and it was really hurtful. And then now they're in this space and they're like, I don't want to be in this space, but I have a hard time making my boundary. Right? So hopefully you see what I'm getting at, where they play a role, and you getting to know more and more of those aspects not only give you that freedom, but give you the insight and the awareness of what to do next. Well, look, you made it to the end. Yes, there could be a lot more on boundaries. I'd like for you to, if you need to re-listen to it, I'd like for you to pick one boundary, see how you can move forward on it. I'd like for you to take a moment, leave a review on the podcast. It's really a wonderful way to, with the way the awesome tech these days work, it spreads the word. I'd love for more and more individuals to have access to care. And this is a lot of what the podcast is. It's bringing therapy, these mental health topics, into the spaces of more and more people. Because we live busy lives, and maybe we don't have that. Maybe time, finances. There could be many barriers that are on the way to have that access. And getting on there, sharing this podcast, leaving a review, subscribing, those type of items from your end to help us here with the podcast to be able to bring it out into more and more spaces, which is part of that goal. So we greatly appreciate your support there. I hope that you found this episode on boundaries helpful, insightful, a couple of nuggets that you can take away. All right, my friends, I'll see you in the next episode.